Hello, friends. If you are watching this online, that probably means that you're staying home right now with what's happening with COVID. I totally respect your decision. The longer this goes, the more cautious I myself feel. We are still following the guidelines, and it's kind of week to week, just seeing what's going to happen here in Oregon and in Tillamook County. I am hoping that we can have a Christmas Eve service at 5 p.m. on Christmas Eve, even if we have to go outdoors and bundle up and sing a few Christmas carols. I'm hoping that in some way we can be together. So, more info to come there. Today is our first Sunday to really dig into our Advent series. So, this is our new Advent series, Dirty Roots. I'm about to tell you a weird story. It's a Christmas story. It comes from Genesis 38 if you want to follow along. And I'll warn you, brace yourself. Tamar. Tamar was a foreigner. She grew up a young Canaanite girl in the ancient Near East, and when she came of age, her father struck a deal with a man named Judah. And Tamar experienced what all girls her age experienced, an arranged marriage. Tamar was given in marriage to Judah's firstborn son, But we're not going to call him We're going to call him heavy on the R, because wasn't a nice guy. Uh, he could be very mean, very cruel. It wasn't a happy marriage. Could be so evil. Tamar was considered Ur's property, his object, his possession, as all wives were in that day. And Tamar and had not been married long when God allowed to die prematurely because of his constant pursuit of evil, of wickedness. God let self-destruct. Of course, had been Judah's firstborn son, and so he was supposed to receive a double portion of his father's inheritance: property, wealth, donkeys, oxen, slaves. But of course, none of that would go to Tamar because she was a woman and a widow. Now, Tamar might have found herself on the streets with no way to earn an income outside of prostitution, but her father-in-law Judah came to her aid. Kind of. Heavy on the kind of. Er's brother was named Onan. So Onan was Tamar's brother-in-law. And Judah told Onan, he said, "Sleep with your brother's wife," that's Tamar, "and fulfill your duty to her as a brother-in-law to raise up offspring for your brother." Yep, you heard that right. Tamar was told that now that her husband was dead, FYI, your brother-in-law is now going to be sleeping with you. And as weird and as wrong as that sounds, this was the way that widows in the ancient Near East were kept off the streets, kept from homelessness. They were kept by brothers-in-law who took them in and had children with them. It was called levirate marriage, and the idea was that if Onan and Tamar had a son, that child would receive all of the inheritance that was supposed to receive, which in this case would be the double portion. Well, if Onan impregnated Tamar, so if this scenario happened, that would significantly reduce the amount of property and wealth that Onan received in his inheritance, because Tamar's son would receive the double inheritance. So it was better for Onan if Tamar never became pregnant. So what did Onan do? Well, he went ahead and had sex with Tamar like a good brother-in-law, but, and I'll try to put this delicately, he always made sure that the necessary ingredients never found their intended target. And you can check the details of that in Genesis 38, verse 9. Well, God was unhappy with Onan's greed, and God saw that Onan cared more about his own inheritance than Tamar's well being. And so God allowed Onan to die a premature death. So Tamar was a widow once again in desperate straits, in danger of resorting to prostitution. Now, Judah could have played the Levirate marriage card again. You see, he had another son in line. His name was Shelah, but the truth was Judah wanted to be done with Tamar. Two of his sons had already died in their marriage to her, and down deep somewhere, Judah blamed Tamar, at least in part, for his son's death. But he wondered, might she somehow bring about Shelah's death as well if he just went ahead and let that marriage happen? And so Judah told Tamar, he said, live as a widow in your father's household, not my household, your father's household, until my son Shelah grows up. It was a promise he had no intention of keeping. He basically pushed Tamar out into the precarious world of widows. Uh, if a male relative wouldn't take her in, like saying, well, go find someone in your father's household, that's a big if. If they wouldn't take her in, she would fall through the cracks. Poverty, begging, gleaning, prostitution, trying to scrap a life together. Even worse, the last thing that you wanted to do as a widow was to wait around for a promise of some kind, like a promise of, hey, this guy, he might marry you someday. Uh, as a widow, twice widowed, you needed to remarry as soon as possible. So there's Tamar. She's left waiting for the promise of a marriage that was never to be. She didn't know it. And so there Tamar lived, scrapping together a life as a widow, waiting. Years passed. Shelah grew up, but Tamar was never given to him in marriage. If she wasn't given to Shelah in marriage, she became expendable. There was no telling what may happen to her. Her chances of finding a husband were close to nil. She would likely end up on the streets if she wasn't there already. And so Tamar decided to take things into her own hands. One day, Tamar heard that Judah was on his way to shear his sheep. And so Tamar hurried to disguise herself. She took off her widow's clothes, clothes that any widow was expected to wear. She covered her face like the prostitutes of the day, and she hurried down the road to Enaim, disguised as a prostitute. And she found a place and set up shop. Well, along came Judah, Tamar's father-in-law. Judah saw her there on the side of the road, but he had no idea who she was. So he walked up to her and bluntly said, come now, let me sleep with you. And Tamar coyly responded, and what will you give me to sleep with you? Well, I'll send you a young goat from my flock. How can I trust you? Will you give me something as a pledge until you send it? Asked Tamar. Well, what would you suggest? Said Judah. Well, how about your seal and your cord around your waist, your staff? And so Judah agreed. So Tamar and Judah, after years of living as father-in-law and daughter-in-law, had sex without Judah knowing who he was sleeping with. And Tamar became pregnant. Months passed. Judah tried to track down that prostitute who hung out beside the road to Enaim. He wanted to get his stuff back, and he had a goat to give her. But no one knew who he was talking about. There's no prostitute that hangs out on that road. I'm not sure who you're thinking of. And so Judah kind of gave up. Well, one day the community ended up at Judah's door, banging on the door, boiling over in zealous anger. Tamar, his daughter-in-law, kind of, used to be, Tamar had been found guilty of prostitution. She was pregnant, and the community wanted to know what Judah thought should be done. After all these years, after everything Judah had done for Tamar, the Levirate marriage to Onan, marrying her off to two of his sons, and all those old feelings of blame for his son's death boiled up to the surface, and Judah shouted in rage, "Bring her out and have her burned to death. Make her pay." Well, as Tamar was dragged out of the house, she sent a message to Judah along with his seal, his cord, and his staff. I'm pregnant by the man who owns these. See if you recognize whose seal, cord, and staff these are. You can just imagine the community bringing these to him. And Judah realized what Tamar had done. He realized that he was the client. He was the father. And Judah knew it was no mistake. Checkmate. What could Judah do now that the community knew that he was the client, the father? It wouldn't look honorable to have his own child burned alive in Tamar's womb. And so Judah had to swallow his words. He finally recognized what justice in this situation actually looked like. And Judah said, Tamar is more just, more righteous than I am, since I wouldn't give her to my son, Shelah. Judah recognized he had not made good on his promise for Shelah and Tamar to be married. That had been a lie from the beginning. He knew he wasn't going to follow through on that. Shelah stood to inherit all of his wealth, but if they weren't married, Tamar's life really hung in the balance. Twice widowed, with no position to remarry, her life hung in limbo. Who knows what depths of poverty she had already faced. The Levirate marriage laws that Tamar had been subjected to said that it was the responsibility of the nearest male relative to provide her with a child. And so Tamar had just taken those laws into her own hands. If Shelah wasn't available, the next male relative was Judah. So Tamar had done what was necessary to secure a place for herself in the family. She had revolted against the established social order of injustice, and by bearing the son of Judah, her child would gain an inheritance, and she would gain a place of security within the family, within the home. Judah had once promised her a place, a marriage to Shelah, and then not kept his promise, and so Tamar had found a way to hold Judah accountable. Tamar the widow was unable to say to Judah, "Hey, you didn't keep your word." But the prostitute on the road to Enaim could demand accountability, could demand a pledge. I don't trust you. How do I know you'll keep your word? So give me your seal, give me your cord, give me your staff. Her actions had been shrewd and daring. She'd taken the initiative in a world that gave her no initiative. In a world that treated her as an object, she used that objectification to claim her personhood. She used her wits to force a male-dominated world to claim her as a person among the people of God. And the story gets stranger, because Tamar wasn't pregnant with just one baby, but with two, with twins, Perez and Zerah. So for Judah, you visit the prostitute one time and you end up with three sons once again, just like that. I want to know what those little boys, Perez and Zerah, called Judah. Did they call him Dad? Did they call him Grandpa? Did they call him Grandpa-in-law? Or dad-in-law or mom's trick or mom's John or grandpa dad. And what were they supposed to call Shelah? Was he brother or uncle or brother uncle? I think there's a country song that's based on this Bible story, and it's got in the chorus, I'm my own grandpa. And did Judah ever give Tamar that goat that he promised to the prostitute on the road to Enaim? And I wonder if Judah ever thought back to the reason he was even alive. It was because his own father, if we went further back on the family tree, his own father, Jacob, slept with the wrong girl too, while she was disguised. And that's his mom, Leah, Genesis 29. So, weird story, huh? But you say, how is that a Christmas story? That's not a Christmas story. Well, you remember all those hopelessly boring, tedious genealogies in the Bible? There are about 25 of them in the Old Testament, and then there are a few in the New Testament as well. It's that part of the Bible that you always skip over. All of the begats. When it starts saying Abraham begat Isaac, Isaac begat Jacob, Jacob begat Judah, so on and so forth, you just say, please, no, and you want to skip it. Well, the story of the birth of Jesus begins with a genealogy. Those are the begats, a genealogy of Jesus, and guess who's in it as one of Jesus' grandmas? Tamar. You can see in the picture there, that's old King James there. Uh, I just wanted to capture the essence of the begats that you'd really rather not read. But there's Tamar. So let's shift gears for a moment, and we'll talk about genealogies. So you've heard the saying, the apple doesn't fall far from the tree. Well, in the ancient world, that was taken to a whole different level with genealogies. Because in the ancient world, people didn't just evaluate you based on your merits. Your genealogy was your claim to power and status and place, office, inheritance. The genealogy functioned like a social map that told people your identity, your reputation, your nobility. It was a guide for social interactions and told people what could be expected from you. So the idea was that you gain meaning and significance because of your forefathers. So you wouldn't say, this is my genealogy. You would say, this is the genealogy of Abraham, and then you would locate yourself within that genealogy because your forefathers give you meaning. And if you got into an argument, you could use your genealogy to put other people in their place, basically saying, hey, this is who I belong to. This is my standing in the community. Now, when someone gave you, like when you gave someone your genealogy, it wasn't just giving them your entire family history, because it was accepted that you might skip some generations. It was more like giving a list of relatives that you wanted to claim. So you might choose to include or exclude various relatives based on which relatives made you look good. Oh, and there's one more important detail about genealogies. Get ready for it. Women had no place in genealogies. Women had no place in genealogies. In a male dominated world, everything surrounding family, inheritance, land, farms, animals, sons, it was all connected to men. So when you read a genealogy or when someone gave a genealogy, it was all men. It was the dads. Remember, women were objects, possessions, seen as extensions of men. So for a woman to end up on a genealogy was strange. It was out of place. And let's say a woman did end up on a genealogy, it was only if she somehow secured the purity of the family name, if she made the family name better, somehow strengthened the family's dignity, then she might make it onto a genealogy. So that's the way genealogies worked. And then there's the genealogy of Jesus. The Gospel of Matthew should start out saying, this is the genealogy of Abraham, and then locate Jesus in it. But that's not the way it's written. Remember, you always name the genealogy by your most noble ancestors. So you want Abraham and David in there to make sure that people know that, you're top of the line. You're a true Israelite. You're of the royal line, of the messianic line. And you really don't need any women in there at all. But if you're going to put some women in your genealogy, like in the genealogy of Jesus, you should put the matriarchs of the Israelites, like Sarah and Rebecca and Leah. They're some of the more heavy hitters as far as the women are concerned. But the genealogy of Jesus, it turns and runs in the opposite direction from status and honor and runs towards scandal. The first woman that Jesus claims as a grandmother is Tamar. Racially different, a foreigner, a Canaanite, an outsider, a woman, a widow, twice. One of the most precarious existences you could have in the ancient Near East. A prostitute, a scandal, the opposite of moral purity. She brings with her a story of sexual irregularity. Like, your father in law is not supposed to be your kid's dad. That's all kinds of tangled up. So, talk about a questionable and disreputable grandma for Jesus to claim. And there are actually four different women that Jesus claims as grandmas, as matriarchs. Tamar is only one of them. This is only the beginning of our Dirty Roots series. It might make you feel like Matthew actually dug through the history of Jesus looking for the most scandalous people he could find, which really isn't surprising given that this gospel is written by a social outcast, a tax collector accepted by Jesus. More to come on that. Jesus' genealogy is filled with people who were crude, disreputable, all kinds of messed up, dirty roots. And it's actually really hard to find people who are pious in Jesus' genealogy. They are few and far between. In a world that believed that you gain your meaning, significance, and identity from your ancestors, and especially your ancestors of honor, Jesus turns that on its head. Because Jesus' ancestors gain their meaning, their significance, their identity from him. This isn't the genealogy of Abraham. This is the genealogy of Jesus. So it's upside down. Now, why does any of this matter? Why do Jesus' relatives really matter to me, to you? Well, because if you dig very far into any of our families, you'll find all kinds of mess. All kinds of dysfunction and weird power things and weird political things and weird relational things, irregularities, skeletons in the closet, people who went off the deep end, burned out, they acted out, scandals, disappointments, secrets, brokenness. You'll find relatives who don't want to claim one another and people they'd rather not mention and stories they'd rather not mention. The family history has been redacted in some way, like, oh, we don't really talk about that. We don't really talk about them. And guess what Jesus does with all the murderers, cheats, adulterers, cowards, sexually irregular, immoral, liars, racially different, foreigner, outsider relatives? He claims them. And that is the starting point for the Christmas story. It's not just Jesus' family. It's the human family. It's dirty roots. What do the dirty roots of Jesus give you for your family and for the human family? So I invite you to discuss that at home with the people that you're with. How does this give you hope? Here's your final benediction scripture, Hebrews chapter 2, verse 11. Both the one who makes people holy and those who are made holy are of the same family. So Jesus is not ashamed to call them brothers and sisters. Jesus claims us as family. Love you, friends. and Merry Christmas.